Racist cop berates black woman in court. Not knowing her sealed affidavit exposes a conspiracy involving him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. And now, let us return to the main character. The courtroom in downtown Columbus, Ohio, carried the quiet tension of a weekday morning where everyone expected routine and nobody expected truth. Naomi Carter sat at the defense table with her hands folded neatly, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She wore a simple navy blazer and low heels, the kind chosen to blend in rather than stand out. To the casual observer, she looked like another black woman being processed by a system that had already made up its mind. Officer Daniel Whitmore stood several feet away, uniform crisp, voice confident, presence loud enough to fill the room without effort. He spoke as if the space belonged to him, as if the bench, the seal on the wall, and the quiet audience were extensions of his authority. Each word he used landed with practiced certainty, not shouted, not explosive, but edged with a condescension that drew subtle reactions from those seated behind the railing. The judge glanced down at the docket, indifferent, while the clerk typed steadily, eyes never lifting. Naomi did not respond. She did not interrupt. She did not look toward Whitmore when he questioned her credibility or framed her silence as defiance. She kept her gaze forward, breathing evenly, as though she were waiting for a bus rather than standing at the center of a public proceeding. Whitmore mistook that composure for weakness. He leaned into it, allowing a thin smile to form as he suggested that people like her always claimed misunderstandings, always blamed the system, always played innocent when confronted with consequences. A few spectators shifted in their seats, unsure whether to look away or keep watching. The air conditioner hummed. A pin dropped somewhere in the back. Naomi remained still. What no one in the room acknowledged was the slim manila folder resting inside her. Attorney's briefcase, sealed and time-stamped, already accepted by the court under procedures that required patience rather than spectacle. It contained sworn statements, dates, internal references, and a map of connections that did not point outward toward some unknown suspect, but inward, back toward the very badge now speaking so freely. Naomi had not come to argue facts aloud. She had come to allow a process to unfold exactly as designed. Whitmore's confidence grew as the minutes passed. He addressed the room more than he addressed her, framing himself as the steady hand that kept order while casting her as an inconvenience. To him, this was familiar ground, measured in years of unchallenged testimony and cases that ended before questions could form. Naomi listened without flinching, counting seconds not in her head, but in the quiet assurance that timing mattered more than reaction. Somewhere between Whitmore's last remark and the judge's slow lift of the case file, the balance of the room shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that Naomi allowed herself a single breath deeper than the rest. She had waited through months of preparation for this moment, and now, seated in plain sight, she remained exactly what she needed to be, patient, composed, and ready for the truth to speak without her raising her voice once. The courtroom settled into a procedural rhythm that felt almost rehearsed, the kind that allowed authority to move without friction. Papers were shuffled. A digital clock above the bench ticked quietly, and a muted rustle of spectators created a background hum that blended into the building itself. Officer Daniel Whitmore adjusted his stance with the ease of someone accustomed to being believed, his shoulders squared, his tone measured, his confidence reinforced by years of unchallenged appearances. He spoke about protocol, about experience, about judgment calls made in the line of duty, each sentence framed as common sense rather than opinion. Naomi Carter listened as she had before, her face composed, her eyes steady, her hands still folded. She did not look to the gallery for sympathy, and she did not glance toward the judge for reassurance. Her stillness was not surrender. It was discipline. The judge leaned back slightly, scanning notes without expression, as if the facts had already arranged themselves into a familiar pattern. The prosecutor nodded along to Whitmore's statements, occasionally jotting down a word or two, reinforcing the impression that the path forward was clear. To anyone watching, it appeared that the outcome would be determined by momentum rather than scrutiny. Naomi's attorney remained quiet, choosing not to interrupt the flow, allowing Whitmore to speak uninterrupted, to explain, to justify, and to grow more comfortable with each passing minute. Whitmore interpreted the silence as validation. He expanded on his testimony, framing Naomi's presence as disruptive, her lack of reaction as evasive, her calm as calculated. His words carried an edge that stopped just short of accusation, wrapped carefully in the language of procedure and concern. Naomi did not respond. She focused on the sound of the clock, the subtle shift of air as someone opened the courtroom door, the weight of the moment stretching longer than it appeared. Inside the file, already logged into the court system, was a sworn affidavit submitted weeks earlier, sealed by order, referenced by case number rather than name. It detailed communications, timelines, and internal inconsistencies that could not be explained away by routine practice. It did not rely on emotion or assumption. It relied on records. Naomi had read it once, then again, then set it aside, trusting the process she had initiated to move when the time was right. Whitmore continued, now addressing the room more broadly, presenting himself as a stabilizing presence, someone who understood the realities others did not. A faint smile crossed his face as he concluded a point, confident that the silence around him meant agreement. The judge finally looked up, not at Naomi, but at the file in front of him, flipping a page with deliberate slowness. The room quieted further, as if sensing a transition without understanding it. Naomi felt the shift before anyone else did, not through sound or movement, but through timing. This was the pause she had anticipated, the moment where procedure caught up to assumption. She did not change her posture or expression. She remained exactly as she had been, allowing the system to speak in its own voice. Whitmore glanced toward the bench, still composed, still certain. He had no reason to believe that anything in this room existed beyond what he could see and control. The clerk's fingers hovered above the keyboard, waiting. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to address the next step, and the quiet that followed carried a different weight, one that did not belong to Whitmore anymore. Naomi Carter had learned long ago that silence could carry more weight than argument, especially in rooms built to reward confidence over truth. As the judge reviewed the file before him, Naomi's gaze remained fixed ahead, not on the bench, not on Officer Daniel Whitmore, but on a neutral point just past the seal on the wall, where the marble met wood. To anyone watching, her restraint looked passive, almost detached, yet beneath that stillness was intention shaped by months of preparation. This was not her first time inside a courtroom, but it was the first time she had entered one knowing that every word spoken against her would tighten a structure already set to collapse. Whitmore shifted his weight slightly, adjusting the crease of his uniform sleeve. His expression relaxed, almost bored. He had answered questions like these before, stood in rooms like this before, and walked out unchanged. The familiarity dulled his caution. Naomi's attorney finally stood, not to argue, but to clarify a procedural point, referencing a filing date, a case number, and a sealed submission acknowledged by the clerk weeks earlier. The words were technical, unremarkable, yet they altered the air in the room. The judge nodded once, slowly, as if recalling something placed deliberately out of sight. Naomi felt the room lean forward, attention narrowing without fully understanding why. She remembered the night she had signed the affidavit, sitting at a small kitchen table under a single light, reading each line carefully before placing her name at the bottom. It had not been an emotional decision. It had been a measured one, supported by documents, timestamps, and patterns that repeated too consistently to be coincidence. She had not written accusations. She had recorded facts. Whitmore listened as the judge acknowledged the sealed document, his expression unchanged, his confidence intact. He had no reason to recognize the significance of a filing he had never been meant to see. To him, this was another delay, another formality before the inevitable conclusion. Naomi's attorney sat back down, allowing the process to continue without emphasis. The judge requested confirmation from the clerk, who verified the submission in a steady voice, eyes still on the screen. A few spectators exchanged glances, sensing a shift, but unable to name it. Naomi did not move. She focused on her breathing, slow and even, trusting the precision of what had been placed into motion. The affidavit had been sealed for a reason, not to protect her, but to preserve the integrity of what it contained until the appropriate moment. It outlined connections between reports, communications routed through unofficial channels, and decisions that consistently benefited the same individuals. It did not dramatize or speculate. It simply documented. Whitmore cleared his throat softly, preparing to continue, but the judge raised a hand, signaling a pause. The room stilled further. Naomi's pulse remained steady. She had anticipated resistance, dismissal, even subtle hostility, but she had also anticipated this pause, the moment when routine faltered. The judge addressed the court with a neutral tone, indicating that before proceeding further, certain sealed materials would need to be reviewed in context. Whitmore nodded, unconcerned, believing this to be a procedural inconvenience rather than a turning point. Naomi allowed herself a single measured breath, not of relief, but of readiness. She had not come to confront anyone. She had come to witness the system do what it claimed it was designed to do when provided with facts that could no longer be ignored. The judge's decision to review the sealed materials introduced a tension that no one openly acknowledged, but everyone felt. The room seemed to contract, drawing attention inward, away from routine and toward scrutiny. Officer Daniel Whitmore remained upright, his expression steady, but a subtle stiffness entered his posture as the proceedings slowed. He had expected momentum, not hesitation. Naomi Carter observed the shift without reacting, her stillness unchanged, her focus unwavering. The clerk confirmed procedural steps in a clear, neutral voice, referencing timestamps and docket entries that anchored the moment in record rather than opinion. The judge requested a brief recess within the proceedings, not a break in session, but a pause in testimony, allowing the sealed affidavit to be reviewed in chambers. The words were delivered calmly, almost casually, yet they altered the direction of the room. Whitmore nodded again, his confidence intact, interpreting the pause as formality rather than consequence. He had navigated reviews before and emerged untouched. Naomi's attorney closed the briefcase gently, knowing that what mattered most was no longer visible on the table, but already integrated into the court's process. As the judge stepped away, the courtroom filled with a restrained murmur, low enough to remain respectful, loud enough to signal curiosity. Naomi remained seated, hands still folded, her posture unchanged. She did not exchange glances with her attorney or acknowledge the attention in the gallery. Her composure was not performance. It was consistency. Whitmore shifted slightly, adjusting his belt, scanning the room with a look that suggested mild impatience. He leaned back against the rail, arms relaxed, projecting ease. To him, this delay was an inconvenience, nothing more. Naomi thought, instead of the sequence that had led here, the careful alignment of documents, the decision to submit rather than confront, the understanding that timing mattered as much as truth. The affidavit had been crafted to speak without her voice, to exist independently of perception or prejudice. It was not an argument, but a record designed to withstand dismissal. The judge returned, expression unchanged, and resumed the bench with deliberate calm. The room quieted instantly. He did not announce conclusions or raise his voice. He referenced the sealed materials in measured terms, noting their relevance to procedural integrity and the necessity of context before proceeding further. Whitmore listened, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, though his outward demeanor remained controlled. Naomi felt the shift deepen, the proceedings moving away from assumption and toward verification. The judge indicated that certain aspects of the affidavit raised questions requiring clarification beyond the scope of immediate testimony. He emphasized process, transparency, and the court's responsibility to examine matters thoroughly. Whitmore nodded once more, but his confidence no longer filled the room as it had earlier. It had begun to thin, stretched by uncertainty he could not yet name. Naomi's attorney acknowledged the court's direction with a brief response, offering no commentary beyond agreement. The spectators leaned forward slightly, sensing significance without understanding its shape. Naomi allowed herself no visible reaction. She had prepared for disbelief, for resistance, even for dismissal, but this measured attention was exactly what the affidavit had been designed to demand. The judge concluded by stating that the proceedings would continue with careful consideration of the sealed materials, and that no assumptions would be made until the review was complete. The words were neutral, but they carried weight. Whitmore stood a little straighter, as if bracing against an unfamiliar current. Naomi remained seated, composed, ready. The process was moving now, not quickly, not dramatically, but deliberately, and for the first time that morning, the room belonged not to authority asserted, but to truth examined. As the proceedings continued under heightened scrutiny, the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted from routine to careful examination. The judge's attention remained anchored to the materials referenced earlier, and each procedural step now carried a deliberate weight. Officer Daniel Whitmore stood quietly, hands resting near his belt, listening as the court outlined the next phase of review. His earlier ease had been replaced by a controlled neutrality, the kind learned through experience, though the confidence beneath it had begun to erode. Naomi Carter remained seated, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if the room itself had slowed to match her pace. The judge requested clarification on timelines referenced in the sealed affidavit, asking for verification of dates, internal routing procedures, and reporting protocols. These questions were not accusatory, but they were precise, and their precision mattered. The clerk confirmed entries from the docket, reading aloud numbers and timestamps that aligned too cleanly to dismiss. Naomi listened without reaction. She had anticipated this moment, the careful unpacking of details that would reveal patterns without commentary. Her attorney responded only when asked, providing confirmations already documented, never expanding beyond what the record supported. The restraint was intentional. Whitmore shifted slightly, adjusting his stance, his eyes flicking briefly toward the prosecutor before returning forward. The prosecutor's earlier nods had faded into attentive silence, his pen now still. The judge continued, noting that the affidavit referenced multiple internal communications connected through unofficial channels, raising questions about oversight and consistency. The words were delivered evenly, without emphasis, yet they landed with unmistakable significance. Naomi felt no surge of vindication, only the steady confirmation that the process was unfolding as designed. She remembered the weeks spent compiling information, cross-referencing public records with internal disclosures, ensuring that every assertion was supported by documentation rather than assumption. The affidavit had not accused individuals by character, but by connection, showing how decisions aligned over time. Whitmore's jaw tightened subtly as the judge acknowledged that further review would be necessary to understand the scope implied by the filing. The courtroom remained quiet, attentive, the audience sensing that something foundational was being examined. Naomi did not look toward Whitmore. She did not need to. The truth was no longer personal. It was procedural. The judge emphasized the court's obligation to maintain integrity, stating that when sealed materials raised credible concerns, they required careful handling and appropriate follow-up. No conclusions were drawn, no outcomes announced, yet the direction was clear. Whitmore nodded again, though the motion was smaller than before, his certainty now constrained by questions he could not dismiss. Naomi's attorney acknowledged the court's statements with a brief affirmation, his tone neutral, his role complete for the moment. The clerk recorded each directive methodically, preserving the moment in official record. Naomi remained composed, her breathing slow, her focus forward. She had entered the courtroom knowing that she would not be the loudest voice or the most visible presence. She had trusted that documentation would carry its own authority when given space. As the judge concluded this phase of discussion, he noted that the review of sealed materials would continue in accordance with established procedures, and that further determinations would be made based on verified findings. The words settled into the room, heavy but controlled. Whitmore stood straighter, as if bracing against uncertainty, while Naomi remained exactly as she had been, patient, grounded, and resolute. The balance had not yet fully shifted, but it was no longer fixed. The system was engaged now, moving deliberately, and for the first time, the outcome depended not on who spoke the loudest, but on what the record revealed. The courtroom moved forward with a measured gravity that signaled a deeper transition from surface proceedings to underlying examination. The judge's focus remained firmly on procedural integrity, and each reference to the sealed materials carried an implicit acknowledgement that the case had extended beyond its original frame. Officer Daniel Whitmore stood with a controlled expression, his posture composed, but no longer effortless. The familiarity he once relied upon had been replaced by a quiet vigilance, as though he were listening not only to the court, but to the shifting ground beneath his certainty. Naomi Carter remained seated, her presence unchanged, her calm no longer appearing passive but deliberate. The judge addressed the room again, clarifying that the affidavit contained references requiring independent verification, including internal reviews and communications that intersected with multiple departments. The tone was neutral, yet unmistakably firm. The clerk recorded each statement, fingers moving steadily across the keyboard, preserving the moment with exactness. Naomi's attorney listened attentively, prepared to respond if necessary, though the court's direction required little intervention. Whitmore glanced briefly toward the prosecutor, whose expression had settled into careful consideration rather than alignment. The judge noted that the sealed affidavit was not an isolated document, but part of a broader submission designed to ensure accuracy before disclosure. He emphasized that such measures existed to protect the integrity of the process rather than any individual involved. Naomi listened closely, recognizing the significance of those words. She had trusted the system to function as intended when provided with facts presented without distortion. The judge continued, stating that the court would initiate additional review protocols, including referrals to appropriate oversight mechanisms, all within established legal frameworks. No accusations were voiced, yet the implication was clear. The case had crossed a threshold. Whitmore's confidence now appeared contained, his earlier assertiveness replaced by a more guarded demeanor. He adjusted his stance, clasping his hands briefly before letting them fall naturally at his sides. Naomi remained still, her focus forward, aware that the most consequential moments often unfolded quietly. The judge paused, allowing the weight of the procedural shift to settle, then addressed the court with clarity, stating that further testimony would be deferred pending review outcomes. The room absorbed the statement in silence. Spectators leaned back slightly, sensing resolution without spectacle. Naomi felt no urge to react. She had not sought acknowledgement or validation. Her objective had been to place the truth into motion, trusting its trajectory. Whitmore nodded again, though the gesture now carried restraint rather than assurance. The judge concluded by reiterating the court's commitment to transparency and fairness, emphasizing that when records raised legitimate concerns, they warranted careful examination regardless of position or tenure. The words resonated with quiet authority. Naomi's attorney acknowledged the court respectfully, closing his notes without ceremony. The clerk finalized entries with precision, marking the moment into record. Naomi remained composed, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged. She understood that the process ahead would unfold beyond this room, beyond immediate perception, guided by documentation rather than debate. As the proceedings transitioned toward adjournment for review, the courtroom held a reflective stillness. Whitmore stood quietly, his earlier command of the space replaced by uncertainty he could not articulate. Naomi rose calmly when directed, her movements unhurried, her demeanor resolute. The system had engaged not through confrontation, but through record and restraint. For the first time that day, authority yielded not to volume or presence, but to verification, and the direction forward was no longer shaped by assumption, but by what had been carefully placed on file. Time moved differently after the adjournment, not faster but heavier, though each minute now carried consequence rather than routine. The courtroom reconvened with fewer spectators, the casual observers replaced by an attentive quiet that suggested awareness. Naomi Carter took her seat again with the same composed posture she had maintained throughout, her expression calm, her presence steady. Officer Daniel Whitmore stood opposite her, his demeanor controlled but altered, the ease he once carried replaced by a careful reserve. The judge entered without ceremony and addressed the room with a tone that signaled purpose rather than repetition. He stated that the review of sealed materials had progressed and that certain findings required formal acknowledgement within the proceedings. The clerk prepared the record, hands poised, eyes focused. Naomi listened closely, her breathing even, her attention fixed forward. This was the moment the affidavit had been designed for, not dramatic, not public, but precise. The judge referenced verified timelines, cross-checked communications, and internal reports that aligned with the affidavit's contents. Each detail was delivered in measured language, grounded in documentation rather than interpretation. Whitmore's expression tightened slightly as the scope of the review became clear. Though he remained silent, his posture upright. The judge clarified that the materials indicated a pattern of procedural irregularities connected through specific channels, warranting further action beyond the immediate case. No names were emphasized, no accusations dramatized, yet the implication resonated unmistakably. Naomi felt no surge of emotion, only a quiet confirmation that preparation had mattered. The judge continued, explaining that the court was obligated to address such findings by initiating formal referrals to appropriate oversight bodies, ensuring transparency and accountability within established legal boundaries. The words settled into the room with deliberate weight. Whitmore shifted his stance subtly, the confidence that once framed his presence now constrained by formality. Naomi remained still, her composure unbroken. She had trusted the process to speak when given evidence that could not be dismissed. The judge acknowledged the sealed affidavit directly, noting its thoroughness, its adherence to procedure, and its role in bringing clarity to matters that might otherwise have remained obscured. Naomi's attorney listened without reaction, his work complete, his silence intentional. The courtroom remained quiet, attentive to each word. The judge stated that based on the verified findings, certain aspects of testimony would be reevaluated, and that further proceedings would follow according to protocol. No immediate outcomes were announced, yet the direction was unmistakable. Whitmore nodded once, restrained, his earlier authority now moderated by scrutiny. Naomi felt the shift fully settle, not as triumph, but as resolution. She had not come to confront or accuse. She had come to place the truth where it belonged and allow it to move on its own. The judge concluded by reaffirming the court's responsibility to uphold integrity, emphasizing that no role or tenure exempted anyone from review when records warranted examination. The statement carried no hostility, only principle. The clerk finalized the record, capturing the moment with precision. Naomi rose calmly when directed, her movements unhurried, her demeanor unchanged. Whitmore remained standing a moment longer, his presence no longer commanding, but constrained by process. As the session concluded, the room held a reflective stillness. Naomi gathered her belongings quietly, not seeking acknowledgement, not meeting Whitmore's gaze. She understood that the most powerful shifts rarely announce themselves loudly. They unfolded through record, through patience, through systems functioning as intended. As she exited the courtroom, the echo of measured words lingered behind her, a reminder that truth did not require volume to be heard. It required placement, timing, and the resolve to trust that when the moment arrived, it would speak clearly enough on its own. The days following the hearing unfolded quietly, without headlines or spectacle, yet their impact moved steadily through official channels. Naomi Carter returned to her routine with the same composure she had carried into the courtroom, knowing that the most consequential work often happened beyond public view. Records were reviewed, communications examined, and oversight processes engaged with methodical precision. Within the courthouse, discussions shifted from assumption to documentation, and conversations once casual became carefully measured. Officer Daniel Whitmore felt the change immediately, not through confrontation, but through formality. Requests for clarification arrived without tone or accusation, framed as standard procedure, yet unmistakably thorough. His earlier certainty gave way to cautious attention as familiar shortcuts were replaced by structured inquiry. Naomi was not summoned to testify again, nor was she asked to explain her motives. The affidavit spoke independently, guiding the process forward without requiring her presence. In administrative offices and review panels, the materials were examined line by line, timelines aligned, and patterns confirmed. Each verification reinforced the foundation Naomi had built with patience rather than urgency. The system, once distant, now moved with deliberate intent. Within the courthouse, the judge maintained a measured distance from the unfolding. Review, ensuring that protocol governed each step. The clerk continued to log developments with precision, preserving a clear record of actions taken. Naomi observed the process from a distance, aware that progress did not require visibility. She had trusted the structure she engaged to operate as designed when provided with substantiated facts. Whitmore attended scheduled meetings with oversight representatives, answering questions framed around procedure rather than intent. The tone remained professional, yet the scope of inquiry expanded, reaching beyond the initial matter into broader practices. Naomi felt no satisfaction in this progression, only a quiet resolve that accountability was not personal but necessary. She had never sought to confront Whitmore directly. Her objective had been to ensure that the record reflected reality. As reviews continued, certain testimonies were reevaluated, and internal processes adjusted to accommodate findings that could no longer be dismissed as isolated. Naomi's role remained unchanged, her involvement complete once the affidavit was submitted. She understood that outcomes would emerge through established mechanisms rather than immediate declarations. Whitmore's presence within the department became more constrained, his responsibilities monitored, his authority tempered by oversight. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, reflecting a recalibration rather than punishment. Naomi watched from afar, aware that true accountability rarely announced itself loudly. It manifested through structure, consistency, and the absence of exemption. The courthouse continued its daily rhythm, cases proceeding, records filed, and decisions rendered, yet beneath the surface, adjustments took root. Naomi passed the building one afternoon, observing its familiar exterior without pause. She did not feel compelled to revisit the space where the process began. Her work there was complete. The truth she placed in her record continued to move without her guidance. Whitmore, now attentive to every procedural detail, recognized that certainty without verification no longer held weight. The shift did not come with reprimand or spectacle, but with expectation. Naomi returned to her life with the same quiet discipline that guided her actions throughout, confident not in outcome, but in process. She understood that justice did not always arrive as a moment, but as a series of measured steps that reshaped systems incrementally. The affidavit remained sealed in parts, referenced where necessary, protected where appropriate, its purpose fulfilled through action rather than acknowledgement. Naomi did not seek recognition for her role. She had trusted that when facts were placed correctly, they would move on their own. As time passed, the changes initiated by the review continued to unfold, guided by procedure rather than emotion. The balance that once favored assumption now leaned toward verification. Naomi carried forward, grounded in the knowledge that integrity did not require validation. It required placement, patience, and the resolve to let truth operate within the structures built to uphold it. The review process reached its conclusion without ceremony, as most consequential decisions often do. Official notices were issued, internal policies revised, and oversight findings documented with clarity rather than drama. Naomi Carter learned of the final determinations through a brief, formal communication that confirmed what she had already understood. The system had absorbed the truth placed before it and responded according to its own structure. There were no public statements bearing her name, no acknowledgments of her role beyond the record itself. She accepted that outcome without hesitation. Her purpose had never been recognition. It had been alignment between fact and process. Officer Daniel Whitmore received notice of the conclusions through official channels as well, framed in language that emphasized procedure, accountability, and the necessity of review. His career path altered quietly, shaped not by spectacle, but by documented findings that could not be ignored. Authority once assumed, now required verification, and discretion once exercised freely now carried oversight. The change was measured, deliberate, and lasting. Naomi returned to her life with the same discipline that had guided her actions from the beginning. She did not revisit the courthouse or reflect publicly on what had unfolded. Instead, she carried forward with the knowledge that integrity had been upheld not through confrontation, but through record and restraint. The building that once represented imbalance now stood as a reminder that systems, when engaged properly, could still correct themselves. Naomi passed it occasionally, observing without pause, her focus fixed on what lay ahead rather than what had already resolved. Within the department, procedures adjusted to reflect the findings, ensuring greater transparency and consistency. Conversations shifted, not in tone, but in substance, with documentation valued over assumption. Whitmore navigated this new reality with caution, aware that the certainty he once relied upon no longer held the same weight. The recalibration was not punitive in appearance, yet carried consequence through accountability. Naomi felt no satisfaction in his adjustment, only a quiet confirmation that fairness did not require triumph. It required balance. The affidavit that began the process remained a part of the record, referenced where necessary, protected where appropriate, its role complete. Naomi understood that truth did not need to be loud to endure. It needed to be precise and placed where it could not be dismissed. She continued her work elsewhere, guided by the same principles that had led her to trust the process rather than challenge it openly. Time passed, and the immediate tension faded into routine, yet the impact remained embedded in policy and practice. Naomi encountered others who spoke of justice as an abstract ideal, and she listened without interruption, aware that its most effective form often unfolded quietly. She did not share her experience unless asked, and even then, she spoke of process rather than outcome. Whitmore, now attentive to every procedural detail, understood that authority carried responsibility beyond presence. The system had reminded him, without spectacle, that no position existed outside review. Naomi's role in that reminder remained unspoken, yet it did not require acknowledgement to hold value. As seasons changed, the courthouse continued its daily rhythm. Cases heard, records filed, decisions rendered. Beneath that routine, subtle shifts persisted, ensuring that verification guided authority rather than assumption. Naomi moved forward grounded in the knowledge that dignity did not demand reaction. It demanded resolve. She had trusted the system to do what it was designed to do when given truth presented without distortion. In the end, justice did not arrive as a moment of triumph, but as a steady correction, restoring balance where it had quietly eroded. And in that correction, Naomi found confirmation that when power is confronted with truth placed patiently and precisely, it does not need to be challenged loudly to be transformed.